Well, hello everybody. I finally have PowerPoint. So today we will be able to actually see the PowerPoint that I'm using to go through these notes here today, which is kind of cool. Let's see here. So, today we are continuing our discussion on the Cold War. I assume that we'll probably end up having a few more folks join us within the next couple minutes here. But I'm going to go ahead and get started by recapping some of the things that we talked about last time with the Cold War and what it's all about. So remember that the Cold War is not an actual physical war in the sense that you might typically think of. It's a more of an ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, who emerge at the end of World War II. In some sense, both of them are global powers, but they also come from very different frames of reference in terms of their experience in the war. So what we talked about last time is that Russia, of course, lost 25 million people compared to the United States losing about 300,000 people in the war itself, World War II. And afterwards, both of them are competing for different global rebuilding Europe in a different global vision. So the Soviet Union, of course, is trying to rebuild all of the areas that it controlled in the eastern territories of Europe that they had taken over and refused to stop occupying after the war's end. In places like Poland and Hungary and Romania and so on, all these areas over here in Eastern Europe now fall under the role of puppet governments of the Soviet Union. And they're going to be trying to institute communist governments and encourage the spread of communism to other regions as well over in the Far East. Places like North Korea, which Russia rebuilt after the war. America took over South Korea. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And also, they are competing against the United States, who's trying to build all of Western Europe up in its image. And one of the ways in which they were successfully able to court the West and get them to continue to, remain loyal allies to a certain degree is by providing a lot of financial aid through what we called the Marshall Plan. And so this is a political cartoon here of Stalin with his sickle and hammer jersey on, and he's trying to block this basketball that says Marshall Plan on it, and then this is European recovery. I showed you this other one too last time about the Marshall Plan and how American dollars are going to rebuild Western Europe, and over here on the eastern side of Europe you can see Marshall-Stalin Plan, and they've got the sickle and hammer plow. And they say it's the same thing without the mechanical problems, and you can see that the lives of folks in Eastern Europe are going to be much worse off comparatively to those in the West, because Russia really doesn't have any money. Industrially, they still lag behind the United States, and they don't, because of their communist government, they don't have the kind of infrastructure necessary to support all of the different spending that's going on. And they just don't have the money. And when Russia does have money, they go to rebuild themselves rather than the territories that they occupy in Eastern Europe, who kind of get ignored and turned into military puppet states. So that's where we left off last time, talking about the Marshall Plan and the money that was used to help to rebuild Europe from America. The big three, which was at Potsdam, that was going to be Truman and Clement Attlee, the new Prime Minister of Britain, and the Soviet Union leader Stalin. Those are the big three. They agreed on the division of Germany. And so I wanted to take some time today to talk a little bit, starting our lecture off, about how Germany is divided up, because it's a little bit confusing. All right, so this is Germany, the territories that Germany has after the war. And it might be easier, actually. Let's take a look at this one. I think this is a really nice way of visualizing how Germany gets divided. So initially, when the war ends, Germany is divided into 4 regions. The British region in green, the Soviet region in red, the American region in orange, and the French region in blue. Now you can see that the French comparatively control far fewer lands than the other regions do, which is also in part due to the fact that France really wasn't involved much in World War II, militarily in helping the Allies win the war. But they do nonetheless receive some lands after the war to occupy for a while. And this takes the burden in some of these coal mining regions and stuff like that off of the United States, and also allows France to help to rebuild after the war themselves. So, but these regions here are the 4 regions of the country of Germany. Now, you're going to see a little multi-colored region right here, squarely situated inside of the Soviet region. And this is the capital of Germany, Berlin. Okay? And they also took and divided Berlin into 4 regions. So if we were to take this little region right here, okay, and blow it up, it's going to look like this. So this is the city of Berlin. And it too, despite the fact that it is situated squarely inside of the Soviet region of Germany, is divided into 4 sectors. Once again, you had an American sector, a British sector, a French sector, and a Soviet sector of Berlin. So, the city of Berlin is divided just the same way as the country of Germany is. And that's the confusing part, because a lot of times people get confused about where the Berlin Wall is. Keep in mind the name. It's in Berlin. And the Berlin Wall was built along the borderland territories between the French, British, and American sectors to prevent the Soviet, the relatively poorer off Soviets, Eastern Germans living in the Soviet sector is what I really want to say. The Eastern Germans, because remember, we're in Germany, so the people who are living in Germany are Germans, okay? So these territories are controlled by the Soviet Union, but the people that they're controlling are actually German. And so a lot of East Germans, knowing that the Soviets didn't really have their best interest in mind in East Berlin, keep in mind, the Soviet Union is rebuilding themselves after the war. They don't care about Germany. They want to keep Germany weak, and they want to keep Germany's economy depressed, because they don't have any interest in seeing a strong Germany once again come back and try and wage yet another world war against the Soviet Union. So East Germans oftentimes would really take desperate measures to escape over to the western areas here in Berlin, so that they could then take a plane and fly over to, say, West Germany, where their lives were going to be a lot better off. And so what the Soviets do in 1961 is that they build a wall, not to keep Americans or British Germans from the American, British, or French sector out, but to keep their own East Germans in. So that's what the Berlin Wall's purpose was. And it was just in the city of Berlin. It's not built across the entire German state, and it's certainly not the Iron Curtain, which is a metaphorical barrier of Western Europe and Eastern Europe. We're talking simply about a wall that was built in the city of Berlin. Now, you can still go and see remnants of the Berlin Wall in Germany, in Berlin today. And they have, there's a whole museum and stuff like that dedicated towards Soviet rule and so on during that time. Now, shortly thereafter, just a few years after the war ends, these 3 territories, the French, American, and British territories, the Western powers, after a few years of trying to do some rebuilding and offering aid to West Germany and West Berlin, remember, West Berlin is considered part of West Germany, even though it's inside this whole red zone here. A few years later, the Brits, Americans, and French say, look, we're going to allow these territories to reunite into a single West German state. And they want East Germany to reunite as well. But the Soviet Union, Stalin in particular, staunchly refuses to give up the military occupation of East Germany and East Berlin. And so a few years after the war, 4 years after the war, West Germany becomes a united independent state. And the Americans, British, and French remove their military occupation from these regions and allow them to unite. But the Soviets do not, and East Germany remains a separate independent state controlled by the Soviet Union. So it's independent in the sense that it's not part of West Germany, but it's not independent in the sense that it is still heavily influenced by the Soviet Union's government. And that is the situation that we see develop by 1949. So you can see here, the USSR, US, Britain, and France each occupy a part of Germany and agree to allow German reunification once she was no longer a threat. Germany was going to pay some very heavy reparations to the Soviet Union in the form of agricultural and industrial goods, and the Soviets dominated their Eastern German zone. They do not want to see a revitalized Germany that could once again pose a threat to them. And they stripped East Germany of much of its resources as reparation payments for the war. So they're taking stuff and using that in Russia to rebuild. Now, we also see a crisis in Germany because in spring of 1948, the Western powers introduced a new currency into their zones and wanted the whole area to reunify. But like I said earlier, Stalin refused to allow a democratic Germany and withheld the Eastern German zone from the German Constitutional Convention that took place. And the Western powers decided to proceed without Stalin and continued to help West Germany construct a new constitution and a democratic state. In response to this, Stalin tries to squeeze the Western Berlin region here. So remember, because these regions in West Berlin lie firmly in the Eastern German territory, they are really vulnerable to Stalin and East German communist rule. So what Stalin tries to do is put the squeeze on West Berlin here to try to get the Western powers not to reunify these zones into a single territory. And the way that he does this is he sets up, let's go back to this one. He sets up a blockade that makes it really difficult to trade in these West Berlin territories. And they start to very quickly run out of resources because what Stalin does is he doesn't allow Western German trucks, Western German, American, British supplies to enter into this East German zone to deliver goods to West Berlin over here. And that's going to really put these folks in a vulnerable position. Okay? And so what the Americans do to respond to this Berlin blockade is that the Allies start this massive thing called the Berlin Airlift, which supplied the city of West Berlin for nearly a full year of doing multiple airdrops because the Soviets, they're not allowing trade. But if you were to shoot down an American or British plane, West German resource plane, to West Berlin, he would have a full-blown war on his hand with the Western powers. And given the fact that just a few years earlier, World War II has ended, and given the fact that this is a humanitarian mission, not a military mission, would really look bad on a global scale for the Soviet Union. So they're not going to shoot down those planes because it would initiate another war, and that's the last thing that Russia really wants to have happen at this time, despite the fact that they really also don't want to see West Berlin supplied. So this Berlin airlift goes on for nearly a year. And despite the fact that the Soviet Union attempted to control all of West Berlin by cutting off, and East Berlin, by cutting off surface traffic to and from West Berlin, the Truman administration initiated a daily airlift, which brought them very much needed food and supplies, including things like coal, food, chocolate, and other things, to the American citizens. And you can see here the planes flying overhead, which would, and you can still see Germany is still in a very affected state here. You have heaps of rubble and other things like that. Many buildings still completely bombed to the ground in Berlin because of the daily nighttime and daytime bombings by the British and Americans during the tail end of the war. And so Berlin is really hurting at this time, and it was unfair to the innocent German civilians living in West Berlin to be cut off from their supplies in the name of a diplomatic blockade to try to get the West to do what Stalin wants them to do. And so Truman refuses to let Stalin get the better of him. They land on lakes to deliver salt. Salt is used in all sorts of capacities for the preservation of meat and other things like that. And then, they would, take and cut up big equipment that they would use to, reconstruct, buildings and other things like that. Basically, construction equipment, heavy industry type goods. They would cut them up, put them on these giant planes, and then weld all that equipment back together once they got there. So the American military, the American Air Force in particular, really goes to great lengths to continue to supply the folks in West Berlin. And it's seen, of course, as a huge diplomatic success in the West Berlin. Berliners absolutely love the Americans afterwards. So the Western powers join their zones into a free nation, and it becomes known as the Federal Republic of Germany, aka West Germany. Stalin later made his zone into what became known as the German Democratic Republic, which probably sounds like a funny name for a state that is going to be controlled by a communist government over in Russia. But the German Democratic Republic, as happens a lot of times with communist nations, they take on very confusing names. So East Germany is communist. It's controlled by the Soviet Union, but Stalin trickily names it the German Democratic Republic to make it seem like it's some sort of democracy, which it's not, or republic, which it also is not. It's another Soviet puppet state. It's communist, and it's going to fall squarely under the jurisdiction of Stalin and the Soviet Union. Economic development after World War II. Well, in West Germany, by the 1950s, West Germany had developed into a stable two-party democracy. The guy that leads West Germany was a guy named Konrad Adenauer, and he led West Germany, towards closer ties with the United States and other Western European nations. Konrad Adenauer wants West Germany to be a participant in a democratic global framework. But he is also staunchly anti-Soviet and really bitter against the Soviet Union. Later on, after Adenauer dies, there's a new guy from a different political party who took over in West Germany. His name was Willy Brandt, and he started a process called Ostpolitik, and the word Ost in German is East in English. And this meant that he tried to open up diplomatic contacts with Eastern Europe. Willy Brandt formally recognized East Germany. He accepted post-war settlements in the East, and this helped to cool down tensions with the USSR, which had been very heated in the late 40s and all throughout the 1950s. By the time that we get into the 1960s and beyond, Germany, or the West Germans, I guess I should say, start to kind of become a little bit more accepting of the split between West and East Germany and more accepting of Soviet Union rule of it. And while they don't like it necessarily, it is the situation that they're in, and there's no hope that they're going to wage a war against the Soviet Union and drag all of the rest of the Western powers into it. So it's more of an approach of being pragmatic and practical about the situation that they're in with East Germany being separated from West Germany at that time, and it helps to cool down tensions with various other Eastern European states as well. Now, after the war in Italy, they adopt a new constitution as well, which brought the Italian monarchy to an official end. And they created a democratic republic, which is still there today, although Italy has had obviously many problems. There were two major parties dominating the new government in Italy, the communists, because they had been so anti-Mussolini during the war, and another party called the Christian Democratic Party. And Italy also remains firmly in the Western European bloc, so they're supportive of West Germany, France, Britain, and on the same side as America as well. England after the war, Churchill and the Conservative Party are defeated, and they are now going to start looking at rebuilding their own nation. They had the British Labour Party, which tries to direct national policy towards solving a lot of the economic problems. Remember, Britain faced a lot of bombing in the early years of the war, and they too had a lot of things to rebuild. And there's a lot of people who are in a very precarious situation there, workers and stuff like that, who are looking for the government to kind of step in and offer some social and working programs that will help put people back to work, help to improve safety conditions, help to improve wages, and help to give people a little bit more security in their employment. So the Labour Party, after World War II ends, concentrates on many issues that had been really big problems for a long time in Britain. And this is their big shot at creating a truly welfare state. Now, eventually, of course, England becomes overburdened with all of these social programs that they institute, and the government has all of this. The government of Britain at that time ends up having a whole lot of. They have to collect a whole lot of taxes to pay for all of these programs because they're very, very expensive. And as time goes on, this becomes a heavy, 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 heavy burden for the government to hold up. So by the time that we get to the late 70s and early 80s, Britain's heavy-handed social welfare programs end up becoming too much to be able to pay for, and we see a time where the government goes through a conservative period where they start to trim the fat and make the economy more liberal again under a woman named Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of Britain from 1979 until about 1980. Well, maybe it was even later, 1979 to maybe about 1990-ish, somewhere in there. She was Prime Minister for a long time. She's a very, very tough woman. Talk about her a little bit later. There was a brief period of time. This is some of the stuff that they did. So to avoid social unrest and revolutions, the British government enacted a number of reforms. They nationalized the Bank of England. They nationalized all of the railways. They nationalized the airlines. They nationalized the coal and steel industries. And when I say nationalized, what I'm talking about is that the British government takes over those industries and monitors and regulates them. And whenever that happens, whenever you let the government take care of programs like that, typically the programs are heavily regulated, and the people working in those programs have a tendency to have some degree of security in their work. But it also means that the government has to pay a whole lot of money to keep those systems going. And that means that there's a lot of tax money that's collected. And as I said a few moments ago, this becomes very burdensome for the whole government to be able to continue paying through tax dollars, and isn't super. It's not super efficient as far as the economy goes. Now, Churchill does briefly return in 1951, and he doesn't really try to destroy the welfare state that had been established by Clement Attlee in the previous prime minister years. But he just demonstrates himself to be a better wartime leader than peacetime leader. So this would be the last time that Churchill is prime minister from 51 to 55, and he would retire from politics afterwards. France is also in a tough situation after the war. They form a brand new government, and it's now known as the Fourth French Republic. But it's problematic. It's plagued by frequent changes in government ministries. It's plagued by factionalism. In other words, the different political parties not getting along with one another. France had a whole bunch of small parties, so they had to constantly rely on those small parties teaming up with one another in what were known as multi-party coalitions to be able to get anything passed. And what that means is that the guy that led the French resistance movement, his name was Charles de Gaulle. He was the leader of the Free French Forces. Remember, Charles de Gaulle was a tank commander. FDR wasn't a big fan of Charles de Gaulle because he thought that de Gaulle had a lot of the same kind of power aspirations that, say, Hitler did. Not the racial side of things, not like Holocaust type things, but just wanted to become a kind of a totalitarian ruler and a French leader. Charles de Gaulle is widely renowned as a French hero. who led the French resistance in France. The biggest airport in Paris is known as Charles de Gaulle International Airport, so they named their airport after Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle has kind of a spotty history in terms of things. He does help to do some things. He makes France a nuclear power. Even to this day, most of France's power is generated by nuclear power, which is despite the fact that nuclear power gets a bad name because of things like Fukushima and Chernobyl and other things like that, you got to remember that actually nuclear power, if you look into the statistics about it, there's a lot of promise with nuclear power and the more recent technologies that have developed with nuclear power, and it could really go a long way to help solve the global crisis surrounding climate change and stuff like that. So France, even today, still generates most of their power through nuclear electricity. He sustained general prosperity of France for a while. He maintained a relatively stable democratic government during that time. And the other thing about Charles de Gaulle is because he is so proud of French nationalism, he tries to pave kind of a middle ground for France in a time when the world is becoming very polarized, where you have a Western democratic side led by the United States, and then you have an Eastern communist side led by the Soviet Union. And I mentioned in our last lecture that a lot of the global issues of Vietnam and the decolonization of Africa, where African nations are repudiating or getting rid of the European rulers of those territories going back to the age of imperialism, they get swept up in this global polarized climate of democracy and communism. France really tries to navigate a middle ground, and France is very skeptical about becoming too close to the United States under the years that Charles de Gaulle is in power. He tries to advocate that the French do their own thing, and it doesn't want to become part of NATO and other things like that. But by the late 60s, Charles de Gaulle has kind of worn out his welcome as the president, long-lasting president of France. He had been in power in France for, I think, 18 or 20 years by that point. And a lot of kind of student unrest and social changes began to challenge Charles de Gaulle's rule. And in 1968, he ultimately resigned, and he died 2 years later of a heart attack. So, there's Charles de Gaulle late in life. Using the Algerian crisis as a pretext, Charles de Gaulle created what was known as the Fifth French Republic in 1958. And what this did was it gave him, the French president, a whole lot more power, and he used his power to try to navigate that middle ground and make France somewhat independent of America. He doesn't want France to just march lockstep in line with what the Americans want the French to do, which was to take a much stronger stance against the East than probably America was happy with what they were doing. But nonetheless, they do remain Western, they do remain democratic, and Charles de Gaulle does eventually step down from power. And then throughout the 1970s and 80s, France goes through another period of change, but they still have the French Fifth Republic in power today. Okay, so these are, as I mentioned earlier, these are just some of the other things that I mentioned regarding the changes that Britain made under Clement Attlee. Also during this time, remember that India gains its independence, and this is really the beginning of the end, and has been the beginning of the end of the British Empire for quite some time. They're in a huge amount of debt by this point from the war, and we see India gain home rule. Palestine goes over to Israel, and so Israel becomes a formal state 1948-49. They are not recognized by the rest of the Middle East right away, and this creates a brand new conflict between the Palestinians, who had been occupying that land for probably close to about 1,000 years or so, and the new relocation of many Jewish folks after the Holocaust and World War II ended increasingly we see more and more and more number of Jewish folks from Europe migrate to the newly created independent state of Israel, which was an ally of the West in the Middle East. And the Middle East increasingly during this time is going to become an area of contention because the Middle East has a whole bunch of oil reserves. And they too are creating independent states. So we see the creation of, say, Syria and Iraq and Iran and so on. And those states, Egypt and so on, are all heavily Muslim states that are going to first of all, not immediately recognize Israel as a state because they see it as a creation of the West, interfering in lands that have for a long time been firmly Muslim lands, and so they don't immediately recognize Israel. But Israel is a nuclear power because it's essentially created by the West and America and Britain and stuff like that. And so very early on, Israel has nuclear power capabilities, including nuclear warheads that they would have been able to use, and of course the full support of America as its big brother over on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, indeed on the other side of the planet. So, and then we see a number of different uprisings as well in British-held territories down in Africa, where they start to break away and establish their independence in places like Nigeria and Kenya and so on. So, we can see some major global changes happening during the Cold War, and they are very much going to be swept up into the conflict of the Cold War. And that's where we get into what we call proxy wars. And proxy wars are where basically wars are going to be fought on kind of neutral territories, that get set up, that get swept up in the conflict of the Cold War, like Vietnam and the Korean War. And all of these are examples of wars that are really wars that took place between America and the Soviet Union on smaller scales, pertaining to the greater conflict of the Cold War going on at the time. So it's this ideological battle happening between the Soviet Union and the United States in kind of these other smaller localized regions of Vietnam, of Korea, of various other places across the planet. You know, there's conflicts in Cuba and there's conflicts elsewhere as well. So, but it's all pertaining to the same thing, which is this ideological conflict between communism and democracy. Okay, so that's going to be how the war manifests on a physical scale, on like ground conflict, is in these small proxy wars. Now, the economic recovery that's going on during this time, basically workers' wages are failing to keep up with the economic growth that's occurring during this time. So to offset the potential social problems with that this could have caused, a lot of Western European states, not only Britain, but West Germany and France and various other places too, start to implement these social welfare protection programs for their citizens to reduce the likelihood that they will start some sort of revolution against the government and create even more chaos and upheaval. So France and West Germany faced many of the same social and economic problems found in Britain. The French Communist Party was somewhat powerful after World War II, and they were some of the ones pressuring de Gaulle to make some of these more socialist reforms, socialism in France. And West Germany also adopted many of these similar reforms to bring recovery and stability as well. But the cost of reform is going to be very, very, very great. And it's still debated today whether or not these reforms should have gone to the extent that they did. Certainly, they were able to help prevent revolutions from breaking out in Britain and France and West Germany. However, they also found it very hard to compete in the global marketplace. And so one of the major changes that we see in Europe after the war is that Europe increasingly starts to operate as almost Western Europe increasingly starts to operate more as a single entity, a single economic entity. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's a long gradual process. That only in the last couple of years we've seen deteriorate when Britain decided to exit the European Union. But that's really what we're talking about here, is that Europe starts to become increasingly tied together economically. So the interests of France and its mining and steel production and so on start to become tied with places like the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, but also West Germany and Britain. And so they're creating this kind of, they call it a single market economy. So Europe is increasingly tying together, not quite the same as the United States is, because the United States is under a single government. You have to keep in mind, these are all still independent nations. They all have their own governments. Britain has its own government, France has its own government, West Germany has its own government. But increasingly we're seeing economically, while they may not be tied together governmentally, economically, these nations are trading more freely with one another. They're operating as a larger single marketplace to compete in some sense actually with the United States. Because as time goes on, because Europe is becoming more and more and more economically tied together, Europe becomes actually a competitor in the global scheme of things with the United States. And that increases even further after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. So we see this process of globalization often having a negative effect for the nations of Western Europe because they had such high wages and very comprehensive social welfare programs, and they were lagging behind due to how heavy of a burden it was to continue to pay via the government for all of these social programs. So under Margaret Thatcher in Britain, for example, there is a significant rollback of this welfare state, and that trend also continues in some other places. Now, comparatively, even today, Europe is far more socialized in its structure than the United States is. For example, most places in Western Europe have national healthcare systems and have for going on nearly a century now, whereas the United States still has a private healthcare system, which itself is extraordinarily expensive and has some issues with it. But nonetheless, some of the best healthcare on the planet is offered here in the United States, and so there is something to be said about that as well. But as time goes on, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and after, in particular, Britain starts to trim the fat from its governmental expenses, what we start to see happen is that Britain, for example, Europe creates a single currency. So they have the euro. Now, Britain doesn't use the euro. They use the British pound, the Great British Pound, and so they don't take on the European Union currency of the euro. But still, in many places in Europe today, if you want to change your money over to European money, instead of changing it over to, say, French currency, francs, or German marks, or British pounds, you still have to do. But there's all sorts of places in Europe, and they each had for a while their own currencies. It's not until about 2000, 2002 that the introduction of the euro comes into place, when Mr. Knight is a senior in high school. And the first time that I ever went to Europe, just after I graduated high school, the euro was already implemented, and it was brought in on an equal par as the American dollar, 1-to-1. You could use dollars or you could use euros, and that exchange rate is pretty similar today. It's not quite the same, but it's pretty close. In fact, just out of curiosity, because I haven't looked it up for a while, let's take a look and see what the actual exchange rate is. 1 euro, let's see here, 1 euro to dollar. Let's see, yeah, it's basically still 1-to-1 today. For a while, the euro was worth about, like $1.49 or something like that. In other words, you'd have to pay more dollars to get 1 euro, but today it's basically the same. You can, if you take a look at this here, you can see that for a while here, this is going back 5 years, it's stayed very, very close to the dollar right here. Let's see, looks like in about February of 2018, the euro was valued pretty high, and then there's other times where the euro is valued more closer to where the dollar is at. But as far as things go, like there was a period of time, if you go way back to 2008, you can see that the euro was like about $1.48 or something like that, and so the euro was, you know, worth considerably more than the dollar was. But the euro is not as stable of a currency, and it's even less stable today due to the fact that Britain has left the European Union, which is a very significant thing because it shows a trend towards nationalism again, which we haven't really seen going all the way back to before World War I existed. Economic nationalism, where nations these days are trying to protect their own economies, especially in light of the COVID thing recently, where global trade reduces, unemployment goes up, and so on and so forth due to this kind of crisis that we're all managing our way through right now. But it makes the economy in Europe a little bit more fragile because the euro is just not as long lasting as the dollar is. It hasn't been long. It hasn't been around as long, and it's not as stable of a currency as the United States dollar is. So that and really, when you look at Brexit as a turning point, it could be if in future years of me teaching this class, we could be looking back at Brexit as one of those things that signals the first time that Europe moves away from becoming a more integrated economy and kind of a global competitor, single market competitor against the United States. Okay, so I'm going to see here if I'm going to take a quick break and see if there's any questions or anything like that, because I haven't checked this for a while. It seems that there are no questions. We have 6 people in here watching this. Now, a couple other things I wanted to mention. We still have some things to talk about with world history pertaining to the Korean War and some other aspects there. I do not have those PowerPoints on my computer here at home, but I'm going to see if I can. I don't think I have access to those here. There's just things I don't have on my home computer that I have on my work computer. You know what? Let's take a look here on Schoology and see if I can find something that we can use to get our way through the Korean War. I have so much I can talk about with that. And also remember, the United Nations is another big aspect of global diplomacy at this time. So the various governments of the world coming together on a global stage to work out problems without resorting to war. The whole purpose of the United Nations, which is the successor to the League of Nations, which was the failed organization after World War I, you might recall, that did not successfully keep the peace. The United Nations, to this point at least, seemingly, has managed to keep us out of some sort of global war due to the ability of nations to come together in a common forum and discuss things before resorting to simply attacking another nation militarily. Let me see if I can find, I wonder if I have, I don't think I do though. I don't think I have it in this one. This is an old Euro section. I've been having to use, I have a lot more Euro materials online than regular world history stuff online. So I was going to see here, oops, if I have any other. That's the Cold War. That's not it. Let me see if I can go over to this resources tab here. Sometimes I surprise myself with all the things that I've uploaded here. ERHS Social Science. Let's go into World History. What do we have in here? Do we have anything? This is all older stuff. What do we got in here? The Cold War. China, Korea, and Vietnam. Let's download this. This is not my PowerPoint, I don't think. I did not make this one. This is, I think, Mr. Sousa's PowerPoint, actually. So I'm not super familiar with the stuff that's in this one, but hopefully it'll be a way for us to make our way through the content, at least, of some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about today regarding the Korean War. So let's open this PowerPoint up and see what we got in here. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is, let's move, okay, so big idea of this part here. It says in both Korea and Vietnam, communist aggression threatened to overthrow non-communist governments. The United States and the Soviet Union intervened in both wars, and while communism was contained in Korea, containment was not successful in Vietnam. We'll get to Vietnam on a different day because that's a whole other ball of wax. And then in Cambodia, which is right next door to Vietnam, a ruthless regime called the Khmer Rouge took power after the Vietnam War and ended up brutally murdering several of its citizens. And there are a number of tales of the anti-intellectual. Basically, they were doing things like killing people even if you wore glasses, because glasses were representative of intellectualism and modernizing Cambodia. And this was a ruthless regime that was trying to maintain the agricultural, simplistic agrarian lifestyle that was prevalent in Cambodia. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this term here, domino theory. I mentioned it last lecture, but I'll mention it again. It's the theory that if one nation comes under communist control, other neighboring nations will also come under communist control. So if you stacked up a bunch of dominoes and clicked over one of those dominoes, it's going to fall into the next one and cause that one to fall and cause the next one to fall and cause the next one to fall, etc., just like dominoes. So because of the domino theory, the United States worried that communism was making a slow but sure progress into new territories that were previously not communist. It really concerns America. They don't want to see communism spreading to the entire Eastern global sphere. And also, if you take a look at this map here, you can see the Soviet Union makes up such a huge chunk of land. They've already taken over, as I mentioned, all of Eastern Europe here. So we see the dominoes falling on this side, but we also see the dominoes falling in the East. We see, areas in Mongolia and Manchuria over here, and even China turns communist thanks to Mao Zedong. After the Second World War comes to a conclusion. I don't know if you remember me talking about this, but China had been in a civil war long before World War II even started, and they only stopped their civil war when Japan had started to successively make their way down the eastern Chinese seaboard here and take over places like Nanking and so on. And it was then that Mao Zedong, leader of the Communist Party, and Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the nationalist Kuomintang Party in China, stopped their civil war temporarily to deal with the bigger issue of Japan invading and also World War II immediately thereafter. And so after the war ends, the civil war that had been going on before Japan invaded China resumes. And in that tail end of the Chinese Civil War, the Nationalist Party is defeated, Chiang Kai-shek is defeated, and the communist forces under Mao Zedong end up victorious, and Mao Zedong turns China into another major global power that is now aligned with the Soviet Union. Now, China was not the global power then that it is today. But a lot of the reason that China is a global power today actually is because communism and its ruthless restrictions have been eased quite a bit going back the last 30 years, and it has become much more of a global competitor. They have rapidly industrialized and modernized. So we're seeing the dominoes fall, and you can see North Korea, which had been partitioned off to the Soviet Union to divide up the responsibility of rebuilding Korea, which had been under Japanese rule for about 40 years by that point. By the time that World War II ends, they divide the responsibility of rebuilding Korea up into North and South. And the reason that North and South Korea are separate even today is very similar to the reason that East and West Germany were separate. It's because those territories were divided amongst the victors of World War II, namely the Americans and the Soviets, to rebuild Korea. And of course, what happens is South Korea was given over to the United States to rebuild, and the United States rebuilt it in their image of being a democratic capitalist nation. And North Korea was given over to the Soviets to rebuild, and they rebuild it in their image of a communist nation with a command-style economy. So to this day, the reason that they are separated goes all the way back to World War II. In case you were ever wondering, how come is it that Korea is a North and a South? Well, it has everything to do with the rebuilding of North and South Korea by the Soviets and Americans, respectively, after World War II came to a close. Then if you look further south here, you can see Vietnam is right here, and Vietnam too was segmented into two areas. North Vietnam was given over to the Soviets to make into their image, and South Vietnam was made over into the American image, or at least they attempted to. But communism was very appealing to Vietnam because Vietnam was very, very, very agrarian, and it had been under French colonial rule. And so that is the story there, and we're going to talk more about that in a bit. Now, I skipped over this slide earlier. What's a guerrilla fighter? If you've never seen what a guerrilla fighter is, it's a member of an informal armed force that fights a stronger force using kind of non-traditional methods: sabotage, harassment, unconventional methods of warfare, setting traps, shooting from hidden places. And guerrilla fighters end up playing a major role in the Vietnam War. It was because of them, really, that the American army couldn't make any progress over time. And it didn't matter how many guerrilla fighters that you killed, because you couldn't force them to see things from the American standpoint. And their guerrilla resistance in Vietnam was highly successful. And by the way, it was the same thing, the same techniques that were used by the Spanish when Napoleon invaded, and it was the same techniques that the Americans used when they were fighting against the Brits in the American Revolutionary War. We used guerrilla warfare techniques, and it made it very difficult for the British to fight against us as well. So let's talk about Korea. So after World War II, Korea was divided by the 38th parallel. And so if we're looking at this global map here, if the equator is drawn roughly right about here or so, if you go up 38 degrees north is where this dividing line between North and South Korea is. So this is the 38th parallel. Don't get that confused with the parallel that separates North and South Vietnam, and that's the 17th parallel, which is down here. So the 17th parallel divides North and South Vietnam. The 38th parallel divides North and South Korea. So the Soviets set up a communist government in North Korea, and the United States sets up an American-backed government in South Korea. And in June of 1950, North Korean troops, the North Korean, not the Soviets, but North Korean communist military troops invaded South Korea. And this immediately makes the hairs on the back of the necks of the Americans stand up, because once again, they're concerned that that domino theory is now going to be encroaching into an American-backed democratic region of South Korea. So the Americans are going to go and support the South Koreans in that war. But if they do so single-handedly, this could create tension, because what if then the Soviets come in and start backing up North Korea? Well, then you'd have a proxy war on your hands, and it could very quickly, thanks to NATO and other things, expand that war into a much larger war over the tiny little Korean peninsula, and simply trying to prevent communism from moving south into the democratically controlled areas of South Korea. So the Korean War, here you can see this is the 38th parallel that divides it. These are the regions up here that are communist, and this is still the North Korean flag today. And then here you have in the South, the South Korean flag and the American flag. Now, how does this war take place? Well, Truman is president still at this time. He narrowly got reelected in 1948. So he's going to be, 48, is that right? 44, yeah, 48. He gets narrowly reelected in 48. And then, and he is president until 1952. And it's in 1952 that President Dwight D. Eisenhower is elected president. But we're still in the Truman era here. And Truman saw this as the first major test. Korea is going to be the major litmus test for the policy of containment. He wants to see how well containment and the Truman Doctrine is going to work. So, under the leadership of General MacArthur. And you might remember MacArthur from World War II. He was the one that famously declared, "I shall return," when the American forces were quickly swept over by the Japanese in the Philippines. And General MacArthur is put in charge of a coalition force. So it's a really brilliant move of what Truman does. Truman doesn't want to just go rogue and bring America into a conflict because he's worried that this conflict is going to create problems on the global framework of widening the war far beyond what he wants to widen it to. So instead what he does is he goes to the United Nations. Now, in order to understand this next part of things, I'm going to actually put the camera back over on me and just explain a few things to you guys here. So the United Nations has a particular framework of how it works. Now, remember, the United Nations is just an organization. It's not a government. It's an organization. It's an independent organization where a bunch of diplomats from different nations come together and they meet and talk about issues in a public forum. And the diplomats that go and represent nations that are member nations of the United Nations organization have to represent the interests of the government of their nation. So let's say that you had an American diplomat who is serving in the United Nations, representing America. They cannot simply go there and talk about whatever their personal beliefs are. It's their job to represent the government. So let's say that person, so right now we've got President Trump. Let's say that our diplomat personally didn't vote for Trump and doesn't like Trump or whatever. That doesn't matter. It's not their personal views that they're representing. A diplomat has to go there and represent the views of the Trump administration, which is in charge. Same thing with any other nation that's a part of the United Nations. At this time, the Soviet Union didn't like the United Nations. And the reason that they don't like the United Nations at this time is a rather complex situation. So the United Nations is a brand new little baby bird organization. It only meets for the first time in 1945, right at the tail end of World War II. So it's only been around for a few years by the time that the Korean War breaks out. So when the Korean War breaks out in 1950, it's 4.5 years old or something like that. It's not a very tested organization yet, and they still haven't worked out necessarily all the kinks yet. And so here's the situation that develops. The way that the United Nations works is that you have what's called, it's almost, you know how the American Congress is divided into two houses. You've got the House of Representatives, which is the lower house. It's the larger of the two houses. And you have the smaller upper house, which is called the Senate. And in order to get anything passed in a democratic institution like the United States has, and the same goes for Parliament in Britain or the Reichstag in Germany, it's a two-house legislature. So something passes at the lower house, then it gets raised up to the upper house. They vote on it. If it passes again, then in our nation, it goes up to the president, and the president can then either decide to veto it or he can sign it into law. That's just basically how laws get made in the United States. A bill gets created in the House votes on it, goes up to the Senate votes on it. If it passes, it goes to the president then decides, okay, it either goes into action or it doesn't go into action. Okay, so that's how a general legislative body works. Well, the United Nations is modeled on that. So the way that the United Nations works as an organization, remember, it's not necessarily making laws, but they're making what's called resolutions, okay? They're trying to resolve global problems before they become military conflict. So they come up with resolutions, and it's voted on very similarly, but it's voted on by the member nations themselves. And the way that it works is you've got what's called the General Assembly of member nations. Now, the General Assembly includes any nation that is involved as a member nation of the United Nations organization. And there are some places that are not represented by the United Nations. Probably the best known of them is Palestine. So despite the fact that the Palestinians think of themselves as a nation, They are not considered a sovereign state, and therefore they have been denied recognition in the United Nations. Okay, Israel, on the other hand, is considered a sovereign state, and it is a member nation of the United Nations. And it would vote in what was known as the General Assembly, where all of the other hundred and some, I forget even how many nations are in the United Nations today, 192 maybe, maybe it's even more than that now. How many nations, let's see, I don't have the number memorized. How many, I can't type on this keyboard, how many member nations are in the UN? It is 193, so I was close. 192, 193 is how many it is now. So there's 193 nations in the United Nations as members, okay? But there's also an upper house, if you will, an upper segment of the United Nations that has 5 what's known as Security Council members. So you have the General Assembly, and then you have the upper house, if you will, of the United Nations, which is the Security Council. Who's in the Security Council, and who got to choose those 5 nations? Well, take a wild guess at who gets to be in the Security Council. United States, Britain, Soviet Union in those days, now Russia, okay, China, who was on the Allied powers fighting against Japan, so they're a victor as well, and France. Okay, so United States, Britain, Soviet Union, China, and France are the 5 Security Council nations. Now, they're permanent Security Council nations, but there are also 4 other Security Council nations that are rotated in and out from the General Assembly. So there's 5 and 4. So there's 9 Security Council members of the United Nations, but 5 of them are permanent and 4 of them rotate from the General Assembly, okay? Now, why is this all significant? Mr. Knight, who cares about the structure of the United Nations? Well, first of all, you should, because it's an important organization to understand on a global framework. But beyond that, it's really important for understanding how the Korean War takes place. So, here's the deal. I mentioned to you a few minutes ago that China had been in a civil war. When it was decided in 1945 that China would become a permanent member of the Security Council, at that time, they were still thinking, the Western powers were thinking that China would be a nice, close ally of Britain, France, and the United States, because they thought that the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, would be able to defeat the Communists in the Civil War. They don't. So, what ends up being a tricky situation here is that the United States, France, and Britain, while the Chinese Civil War is going on, 1946, 47, 48, and 49, okay, while the Chinese Civil War is going on, the representatives at the United Nations are from Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang Nationalist Party, which are friendly to the United States, France, and Britain. Okay? But remember what I told you. The Kuomintang loses the Civil War. So what happens is, when the communists take over, rather than allowing communist representatives to come over and represent China in the United Nations, the British, French, and Americans refused to accept Mao Zedong's rule over communist China, newly created communist China, and instead still consider China, even though it's no longer being ruled by Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang Party, they still are only allowing Chiang Kai-shek's representatives to come and represent China in the United Nations. Now, you can say that this is pretty unfair from the from the Soviet Union standpoint, because the Soviet Union would love to have a second representative in China on the permanent member Security Council, because then it would make it 3-2 in terms of 3 Western democratic nations against 2 communist nations. But instead, the West was only recognizing Kuomintang, the defeated Kuomintang, in the United Nations. And in response to this, the Soviet Union boycotts. They stop coming to the meetings of the United Nations. Okay? Now, why is this significant? Because the Soviet Union stops coming to the meetings, they forfeit the one special ability that the permanent members of the Security Council have, which is the veto ability. So one of the perks of being a permanent member of the Security Council is that you are given a right to veto any resolutions that you don't see fit in accordance with keeping global peace and furthering your nation's agenda on the global framework. So think of it this way. If the Soviet Union were there at those meetings, they would be able to veto any resolutions that the West was putting forth. Okay? Same for the United States. If the United States doesn't like a resolution because it's too communist or too pro-Soviet, the United States, Britain, or France can each veto those resolutions. So the veto power is very, very important in the framework of the United Nations. Well, how does this relate to the Korean War? Well, when North Korea invades South Korea, remember I told you that Truman didn't want to just go rogue and start sending straight American troops in there, because it could have initiated a global conflict with the Soviet Union, which at that time in the late 40s, man, it was super tenuous. I mean, it could have really quickly resulted in nuclear warfare and nuclear nukes being dropped on cities and stuff like that. It was a scary, scary time. So they don't want to do that. They want to go into South Korea as what's known as a coalition force. In other words, they bring in a whole bunch of different nations' militaries in there. And what that means is it makes it seem less like the United States is just pushing their global agenda, and instead making it seem like it's a global teamwork thing. So the Soviet Union, as I told you, had been boycotting the United Nations, which meant that because their representatives, their diplomats, weren't showing up at the United Nations, they also weren't able to veto any sorts of resolutions that were being passed by the member nations of the United Nations. So when Truman goes personally, as President of the United States, he personally shows up, which doesn't happen too often. He personally shows up at the United Nations meetings and gives a speech to the nations that are there. And he says, look, we are facing a very real threat of communism spreading from North Korea into the sovereign nation of South Korea. We have the potential for a widespread global war to break out here, and we don't want to see that happen. We simply want to see South Korea's sovereignty preserved and not allow them to be overrun by communist North Korea and in what is obviously an aggressive military maneuver. Well, this resolution ends up being passed by the General Assembly, and then it goes to the Security Council. If Russia had been there, they would have been able to veto that, but they weren't. Now, China would have been able to veto it as well, but remember, China is being represented by the Kuomintang, which is pro-Western. And so they don't veto it either, despite the fact that they would have vetoed it if Mao Zedong's representatives were there. So this resolution ends up being passed, and the United States now has a multinational coalition military force of the United Nations that is able to go into. So this is now a United Nations coalition force under the leadership of American General Douglas MacArthur that goes into South Korea to try to stop South Korea from being taken over by communist North Korea. So that's where we see the start of the Korean War. And now I'm going to jump back to this so I can talk a little bit of how this goes. So the United States very quickly responds by using naval and air forces called upon by the United Nations and this multinational coalition force to send troops into the region under the leadership of General MacArthur. And they start the way that they do this. General MacArthur is a old time World War II military hero. Okay, he is loved by the American citizens. And here's General MacArthur. And he often is pictured with his famous corncob pipe and stuff like that. He's kind of an old, rugged John Wayne sort of a guy. I don't even know if you guys know who John Wayne is. He's an old, like, Western actor from the 1960s and stuff. And so, anyhow, General MacArthur launches. So this is a perimeter at Pusan. What had happened is that the North Koreans very quickly swept into South Korea, and they pushed the South Koreans almost right off the peninsula down here. And so they established this perimeter at a place called Pusan. That's this region right here. The city actually is right here. And so here's Pusan, and the North Korean forces are trying to overtake Pusan. Well, the United States coalition force of the United Nations sets up this perimeter here to stop the push. And then they set up a surprise attack up back over this way at an area called Incheon, Inchon. So this is the Incheon landing. The U.S. forces surprised the communists from a kind of a rear amphibious attack at Incheon right here. Now, the capital of South Korea is Seoul, Seoul, and it's right here. Okay, it's right about right here. It's very close to the border of North and South Korea. So you can see that really what they're trying to do is reinforce this region here right close to the capital of Seoul, South Korea, and be able to surround the communist troops here, force them to surrender, and then start pushing the communists back over the territory here, all the way up almost to the border of China, which is right to the north up here. So if we look on this map here, it's probably a little bit easier to see. You can see China is right up here. Actually, this is Russia over here. So Russia even too it wouldn't be too difficult for them to get involved as well. So we now see the Korean War going on, and the Korean War is from 1950 to 53. My grandfather was in that war, actually, my dad's dad, serving on a ship called the USS Cogswell in the U.S. Navy. And the Korean War, the Korean War is now fully underway. Now, as the North Korean troops were pushed towards China, the Chinese government starts to see this as a threat under Mao Zedong and warn the United Nations to stop moving their troops closer. But these warnings get ignored, and so China enters into this conflict by launching a massive attack because Mao Zedong doesn't want to see a multi-coalition force start to threaten the recent communist government that he just installed in China. So China reinforces North Korea with 300,000 Chinese troops that are sent in there, and very quickly the UN troops are now forced to retreat back across the 38th parallel. So we see them move all the way up to start fighting in this region, and then the Chinese send their forces in and they push the UN forces right back down to this 38th parallel here. And frankly, it creates a stalemate for the next several years of the war from 1951 until 1953. Most of the battles take place right along this 38th parallel, which is still the parallel that divides North and South Korea today. Now, as the North Korean troops... Oh, sorry, I did this one already. So here you can see the reinforcement of the Chinese forces pushing those American forces back across down even past the 38th parallel, and then they do another pushback, and then they settle right along the 38th parallel there, and that's where a lot of the fighting takes place. So MacArthur is frustrated at this time. He wants to fight back harder against the Chinese using the full onslaught of the American military at that time. He wants to go full-blown nuclear. Truman's like, MacArthur, are you nuts? We can't use nuclear weapons against China. It's going to bring in the Soviet Union into the war, and you're going to create a whole new global conflict over the Korean Peninsula, and that's not what we want to have happen. So Truman's trying to get MacArthur to tone it down and relax a little bit. MacArthur goes out. Now, remember, MacArthur is a general. I don't know how much you know about the president's role, but one of the few roles that the president really has in terms of like powers dictated to the president outside of Congress is that the president's the commander in chief. So on a very real sense, Truman is the boss of MacArthur. And if Truman makes a statement regarding what the troops are going to do, the expectation is that all of your generals, even the highest ranking and most beloved ones like MacArthur, listen to you because you are a subordinate to the commander-in-chief. Commander-in-chief means that the president controls all operations of the highest ranking military officers. So when Truman says no to MacArthur, the expectation is, MacArthur, you follow those orders because you're a general. MacArthur doesn't do that. He goes and publicly criticizes. He goes above the president's head and goes to the press and says that Truman is looking for the United States basically to be this weak, pathetic force that isn't going the full length that it could go to secure victory in Korea. And he famously says, there is no substitute for victory. And in response to this, you can't just go and criticize your boss in the papers. It really doesn't look good. Truman fires MacArthur for insubordination, which is fully within the powers dictated to the president. So, after replacing MacArthur, the UN troops continue to battle against the North Koreans without escalating that conflict to a nuclear global war with the Soviet Union. And by 1951, the North Koreans had been pushed back across the 38th parallel, and the war starts to slow down, and then peace negotiations can begin. Now, technically, a formal peace agreement has never, ever, ever been negotiated between North and South Korea. Technically, they are still at war, quote unquote, today. Now, do they actually battle one another? No. Since 1953, there has been an armistice in place, a ceasefire that stopped all military conflict between North and South Korea. So there are no more battles after 1953, but technically the war never actually formally came to a close. So technically they are still at war today. And even still today, if you look at this region that separates North and South Korea, this border, the 38th parallel, is known today as the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. And it's a heavily fortified region where tensions remain very high between the communist Northern Korean side and the Southern Democratic Korean side. And famously, recently, for the first time ever, President Trump went and met with North Korean dictator, the first time that a president has ever met a dictator of North Korea, because typically they've been like generally really ruthless and totalitarian and terrible, which Kim Jong-un is very ruthless even today. There are all sorts of prison camps and labor camps and stuff like that North Korean citizens work themselves to death in. A third of the population of North Korea is starving today. They don't have a lot of, they constantly have power outages. Brownouts are what they call them, because it's not total blackouts, but different regions go through just North Korea is such an absolute mess due to the totalitarian, brutal nature of the government there. So famously, Trump went and actually met with Kim Jong-un at the DMZ, which was a pretty serious thing. I think the verdict is out there a little bit about what that means for the future of North Korea, because North Korea is really probably not a very trustworthy nation. So it'll be interesting to see how future developments happen there in modern day times. But just to kind of try and connect it to today, the DMZ is still very tenuous situation. And so anyhow, that's basically the Korean War. Aftermath of the Korean War, the demilitarized zone was set up. It still separates North and South Korea. North Korea remains communist nation, and South Korea is still a democratic capitalist nation. And of course, that has allowed South Korea to make all sorts of really wonderful products. There's a lot of very famous brands that come out of South Korea today. And too, culturally, they also have taken on a lot of the same American or similar, at least, American styles of music, where you've got like K-pop and stuff like that. Samsung is a very successful Korean company. You've got car companies like Kia and Hyundai that are, affordable auto manufacturers for folks and stuff like that. So South Korea has done really, really well since the end of the Korean War, and the same cannot be said of North Korea. So. Folks, that brings us to the end of today's online lecture pertaining to the Cold War. Thank you so much for those of you who tuned in today. I hope that you found today's I hope we thought he was dead. Nehemiah, there was a rumor swirling around about that with the whole COVID thing, because Kim Jong-un was not seen for a long time. Maybe has he? I think he's been seen since. I think it's been confirmed that Kim Jong-un is alive. Otherwise, I think I would have heard by now that Kim Jong-un died of COVID. My understanding, North Korea is very, very, very secretive, and there's not a whole lot that's known about what happens inside of that nation because of how isolated they are. But my understanding of the situation is that he likely had a heart procedure, and that is why he was out of the public eye for several weeks and was recovering from that. Obviously, Kim Jong-un is extremely heavy set, and I think he has some other health problems and stuff like that. So my understanding is that's probably the best explanation for why people thought he was dead for a while, but I think that he is still alive. But again, like I say, it'll be really interesting in your guys' lifetimes in particular to see how things progress with North Korea, because I think they're kind of reaching a breaking point in North Korea with how totalitarian and brutal the rule is there. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up, because I probably should have mentioned that. But thank you folks so much for tuning in today. I'm going to be now working on making online assignments available to you. I know I did not make an online assignment for Friday, but I am going to make one for today. I'm going to do another vocab assignment that will be worth double what the usual online assignments are worth. That will be due on Friday, as will today's assignment will also be due on Friday, and then you'll have a new assignment that we will do on Wednesday. So 2 assignments today that I'm going to give you until Friday to complete. One of them worth 20 points, one of them worth 10 points. And by now, if you've been doing all of these assignments, we've done 4 weeks worth of 4 weeks worth of assignments, which totals about 120 points. That is a whole lot of points. And this week we'll add even more, up to about 160 or 70 points. So this is, if you're doing all of them, or if you've done all of them up to this point, I congratulate you, because that probably is having a pretty significant impact on improving your grade to this point. So anyhow, folks, again, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to sign out here, and I'm going to get up all this other stuff situated on Schoology. Stay tuned for that. Take care. See you on Wednesday.